Hi, welcome to BUS 3410. Today we're talking about success in year one. When you start off in a new job, everyone you work with will be developing their impression of the type of person that you are. Are you someone everyone is excited to work with, or are you someone that there are concerns about, whether or not you're going to make it at the company, for instance? Larry Summers, a former president of Harvard University, spoke about this in mathematical terms that really resonated with me. People form their impressions as an average. If they've only had 2 impressions of you and they get a third, then it can move you as much as 3 halves. But if they get 96 impressions so far and then they get a 97th, it won't have a big impact. In relation to starting a career, this is good news because the impressions you make in a new job are very likely under your direct control. Why? Because your impressions to start are more about your attitude and your conduct rather than your work performance. Yes, results are going to be important, and we're going to hear from our guest today, Alicia Reece, about the importance of performance. But I want to impress upon you that you have so much control about how people are developing impressions about you in the first few months of your career. So that's why we're focusing today on your first year on the job. We are so fortunate to be speaking today with Alicia Reece. She has mentored so many people through her position as a career coach, and she can give us great advice on this area. As a matter of fact, she is the author of the First Year Roadmap. Go ahead and grab your course reader if you haven't already and turn to this page so that you can follow along. We get to hear straight from the author about her ideas that are found within this roadmap. Alicia had wonderful things to say to me today, so I'm not going to really be talking much and really be letting her steer the conversation. Early in the conversation, we move into discussing emotional intelligence again. This is something that we brought up in last class, and it's not surprising, as emotional intelligence is the heart of relationship building, and relationship building is at the center of professional success. We also get into a great conversation about introversion versus extroversion. How does that relate to the way that we are positioning ourselves at work? Alicia is going to share with us some career coaching techniques that will boost your confidence. She'll be talking with us about stepping into discomfort in order to grow and being mindful of your brand, something that we talked about earlier on in the semester. She's going to talk to us about mentors in and outside of the workplace. Some of you might know that I run the business mentoring program for the College of Business. If this conversation today is something that makes you think that perhaps you want to start thinking about mentoring, please be in touch. I'll send you some information about that program. She also gives us great information about how to assess a culture and having difficult conversations that would make your job better aligned to your strengths and your values. Just a word of warning, there are some kids playing in the background, so you may hear the occasional sound of joy, but I hope that you get a lot out of today's conversation. Thank you so much for being part of this class. And now to our conversation with Alicia Reece. With us today, we have Miss Alicia Reece. She is a career consultant in Atlanta and a UTC alumna. Just a wonderful woman who's going to be giving us some things to think about in your first year on the job. So as you transition from student to professional, what should you be keeping in mind to make sure that you're positioning yourself well? So Alicia, thank you so much for joining us. And if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we start.
Absolutely. And it's nice to be back. Hi, everyone. So again, as Irene mentioned, my name is Alicia Reece. Over the past 20 years, I've really been working at the intersection of people and business. And what that translates to is I've worked in various HR leadership roles. About 12 years ago, I noticed that for me, that I really was doing great work and delivering results, but I wasn't fully energized. And so I took a step back, got clear about what was important to me, how I wanted to show up, and it was around coaching and development. And while I had touched that work throughout my career, I wasn't necessarily doing it on a full-time basis. So I went through formal coach training, graduated from the program, became an internal leadership coach within Cisco, started a part-time practice, and then about 4 years ago, I transitioned the part-time practice to full-time practice. So now I do coaching and consulting. Cisco is a client of mine. I have other clients I work with as well. And that work has not only allowed me to travel across the U.S., but also in the U.K. So
that's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
that's
great.
a little bit about me.
So let me ask you, like, when you made the decision to become an entrepreneur, was that a scary step for you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was very scary.
Yeah.
At the same time, I feel like I had prepared, I had started formal coach training. I had, that knowledge. I also had a really great, strong, what I call internal board of directors. And I definitely think as the students are graduating to think about who could be on their internal board of directors. And what I mean by that, people who would be able to serve as advisors to you throughout your career. For me, that consists of mentors. It consists of sponsors. It consists of family and friends who really can have an objective view. So certainly it was scary. I literally had a 6-month plan. And again, I'm here 4 years later, but it's important to ensure that you have the competence, the confidence, as well as the work ethic, because I have to tell you, I've never worked this hard before in my life. I never, like seriously, but I truly love what I do. I'm fully like all in. So even if I'm working on the weekends, which is very often and common for me, I'm energized because I love what I do.
Awesome. I love that. So tell us a little bit about how you want our students to think about their career. Like what's the perspective? What's the point of view you want them to take when they think about their first year?
For me, I think about my own first year. I went through a formal HR leadership development program, and a part of the program, you had an opportunity to engage with senior executives. And for me, that was the chief HR operating officer for this company. And I remember earlier on in one of my assignments, actually at their headquarters in Ohio, where I had a meeting with the CHRO, and I was excited. I thought we were going to talk about all of the amazing projects that I was leading, and I prepared myself. And then when we got into the conversation, he didn't want to talk about my projects. He just started having casual conversation with me. And one of the questions that he asked me was, what was my definition of a career? And I can remember saying something to the effect of, oh, it's this defined path that you take, or defined discipline where you continue to move upwardly within the organization and you're able to deliver results. And he looked at me and chuckled a bit, and I was like, oh, I thought it was a good answer.
Yeah.
But in actuality, he actually shared with me that a career is really a collection of experiences that you have where you're able to add value and grow. And interestingly enough, sometimes it may not necessarily be vertical. It could be horizontal in terms of being able to have different assignments where you're able to continuously grow. And from that point on, I felt like I had a different perspective about a career, and it wasn't necessarily about climbing the corporate ladder to get to the very top. Having these different experiences may not necessarily be linear, for example, because I think oftentimes we think there's this linear path, but there could be twists and turns, and being able to take each opportunity or each assignment as a stepping stone toward realizing your overall potential and realizing your goals. But at the end of the day, it is about learning, it is about growth and being able to add value.
So along the way, were you like reflecting actively and thinking, okay, this is what I'm learning from this, this is what I've gotten out of this experience? Were you that good about your career focus that you were able to like stop and define, like, this is how I'm growing right now?
Yes. So I would say before that conversation, I was more focused on the experiences that I had based upon what I had seen, whether it be different, honestly, TV shows where I saw people climbing the corporate ladder, or when I was in business school at UTC, hearing from people who would come in from the community and just seeing where they were in their careers. So I was like, oh, wow, this is what I should do. Not necessarily focusing on where am I today? What am I learning? how am I growing? How am I adding value? So I did start to ask myself those questions. And I also started to ask myself, what is energizing versus not? Because I think that that's really important. So many people I coach on a day-to-day basis are in positions where, yes, they have the prestige, they have the job titles, they have the financial, means, but are terribly unhappy and they're feeling stuck, and it's literally like dying a slow death every day. And I'm reminded of a time with a company I was with years ago where I was still climbing, the corporate ladder, and I was with an organization. They literally had doubled my salary and had given me a lot of autonomy. I was in the number one role. I was not happy. It wasn't that I couldn't do the job. It's just that I didn't want to do the job. It just wasn't necessarily connecting with me. And it was such a defining moment, Irene, for me, because it was one of the first times in my career where I literally had to pause because I had been on kind of this fast track. And I paused and I got clear about what was important to me. What type of work did I want to do? Where did I want to live? And not necessarily looking at what was the outside quote unquote standard, but what was really my path. And I think that's a really good point for students to get clear about is, what is your path? I think it's always great to look at the external view just from a case study benchmark perspective. But at some point, you have to get clear about your path. And it may not necessarily look like your counterpart or your classmate's path. Because I think sometimes, especially earlier on in our careers, we get caught up. I got caught up. I was in this formal leadership program, as I mentioned. I'm seeing people getting promoted or getting certain assignments. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, what did they do? Here's what I need to do. And you really need to focus on your own path.
Right. Yeah. And I hear that all the time when people say things like, you've got to define your own success. But it's really interesting because we don't think about the action. And the action is to pause and reflect. Like, what are the strengths being tapped into here? What am I not getting to use my brain for that I feel like I need to? And those are very self-reflective. You cannot look externally for those kinds of answers. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I like that. Talk to us about the career journey. So, you were saying that there is lots of detours to be expected. Do you suggest that people have a destination in mind when they start, or do you say let that go? What's your perspective there?
Yeah, so I definitely think it's important to have a plan. Now, I have talked with some prospective clients who have said, oh, I have this 25-year plan.
Dang.
I don't necessarily agree with a 25 or 30-year plan. In fact, I was reading Michelle Obama's book a few years ago when it first came out, her book Becoming, and she even talked about the fact that you really shouldn't have this like extended plan. Think more so in terms of milestones, like instead of like, oh, here's my destination, but what is your first milestone as it relates to your career? And it could be looking at a particular assignment in order to build certain skills. And once you build those skills, what does the next milestone look like in your career? So I would rather see students do that, because if you're able to think in terms of milestones, then you can look at your key learnings. You could test, does this really feel good to me in terms of the type of work? Where would I change, if you will? And that way you may have to go a different route, to move forward. I feel like, to me, that's a better way versus, again, here is my 10 or 15-year plan. Let me continue to move down that path.
Let's talk about the actual first year. So let's assume that my students are coming out and they're finding jobs that align with their first milestone destination. What do you suggest they do in that first week to make sure that they're setting themselves up to be successful in that workforce?
Absolutely. So I definitely think it's important to focus on building relationships, as well as thinking about the type of results that are needed in order to be successful. And a part of that is doing your due diligence to understand the organization, understand not only what you see just in terms of the home pages for the company's websites, but think about the organizational cultural dynamics. Who are key players within the organization, particularly within your function? Because what I normally tell clients is that there are different organizational layers from a cultural perspective. You have the macro culture, which is kind of the overall culture looking at the core values of the organization and the guiding principles that really, for the most part, the GPS for how you navigate. But then as you start to double click, think about your own respective department. Understand your manager. What are his quirks or her quirks? What are their key care abouts? How do they measure success as it relates to the overall body of work that they're responsible for? And then how would they measure your success based upon the work that you've been assigned? And I think it's also important to ensure that your work has a line of sight to the broader work within your manager's scope of responsibility. And then starting to ask the question, how does your work and the broader work within your manager's responsibility align to the broader goals and objectives of the organization? And once you have that detail, then I think it's important for you to get clear about other relationships outside of your manager that you need to be cultivating. And that could be, especially in organizations where they have matrix environments where you may report to your manager, but you have a dotted line to other functional leaders. Who are those functional leaders? Go through the same exercise. And you may even want to create a stakeholder map. And I know it may sound tedious, but I honestly, even mid-level professionals and senior level professionals, they create a stakeholder map because what's nice about it, it gives you a view into the different personality traits of the people you're going to be engaging with. So think about it from the standpoint of key care abouts, quirks, what type of personality profile? Is the person dominant? Does the person like to get straight into a conversation, or do they want to talk about the weather, for example? Starting to get underneath those pieces so that when you go into meetings with these individuals, you will know how to engage. And you will know how to tailor your message to your audience. Does that make sense?
It does. So you're not saying change yourself based on this information. It's just adjust your technique based on this information.
Adjust your technique, and you may have to adjust your style. And sometimes, with clients, well, I am who I am. I want to be authentic. You certainly want to be authentic. And I always say that your authenticity is your superpower because there's only one you.
Yes.
So you need to make sure that you stand in your authenticity. At the same time, you also want to make space to be able to tailor your message, even though it's still you, your authentic self. You still may want to tailor to ensure that the person on the receiving end of your message, that they hear you and that they connect with what you're trying to say.
Right.
And fundamentally, I think that that's important. One of the things that oftentimes is not talked about is what most people know as emotional intelligence. And I've done a lot of work. I'm certified in emotional intelligence. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about now fall into emotional intelligence. And what emotional intelligence is really being perceptive of how you show up, as well as understanding other people, how you manage relationships, how you navigate decision making and stress to get to the outcomes that you want. And it's a set of emotional and social skills to be able to do that. So it is important that you start first with self before you communicate externally. How are you feeling? Are you confident in what you're saying? Even have practices that will support you and bolstering your confidence, because honestly, that's a huge part of being successful in corporate America. And if you're an introvert and you're quiet and you're not speaking up, oftentimes people take that as a form of weakness. And that's the reality, a form of weakness, or maybe they feel like you're not as engaged as you need to be.
Right.
And I know that from a personal history from clients I've coached, because starting out early in my career, I was very introverted. I would literally be at the conference table with my peers and higher ups and would have really good thoughts, but sometimes I would hold back because I felt like, oh, well, maybe that's not the answer, or, oh, I don't want to sound like this. And somebody else in the room, this is what happened. That's kind of helped me. Somebody else would say what I was thinking, and they'd be like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Right. So it really was like, wow, I need to start speaking up as well. So that would definitely be something that I would encourage students to do, is to really think about how you want to show up. Think about your voice and how you want to use it. And, I love Michelle Obama, so I quote her quite a bit. And so one of the things that she said, like, if you have a seat at the table, you need to use your seat at the table. You need to use your voice, or give your seat to somebody else.
Huh, that's interesting. So what would you say to a student who is introverted and not quite ready to, okay, I think about this. Like, I love situations where I'm brainstorming and I'll just come up with ideas and I'll shout it out. And what I also recognize is that what I'm doing there sometimes is quieting other people, because they don't think in terms of springboarding new ideas. They are more of the, I'm going to take this conversation back to my office, contemplate on it, maybe read a couple of articles and come back to you with thoughts. Like, how would you coach someone who is young in their career, not ready to be vocal, but ready to use their voice? What would you say to that introvert?
One thing I would say is I would think about, again, what are the organizational dynamics within your group, and even in the type of meetings that you're in? Understanding how success looks like. So for instance, am I rewarded for speaking up, or is it the environment where I can go back and noodle on everything that's being said, do my own due diligence, and then come back with a recommendation? In some environments you can. In other environments, they want collaboration to be live and in full effect. And in some cases, they want collaboration to be debate, where we may not necessarily be saying the same thing, but we are debating so that we can get to the best course of action. Right. So if you are in a situation, there is a book called Quiet that I would recommend that you get. It does discuss strategies that introverts can use. Also, there is a book called Presence by Amy Cuddy. She's done a lot of wonderful work at Harvard. And one of the things that she's talked about in her book, which I think is phenomenal, and I've used a lot of her strategies with clients, is to do power posing. So before you go into a meeting and you're going to be feeling this level of introversion, take like 50 seconds before you go into the meeting and start power posing. Like power posing.
Interesting.
To get into your body, to boost your energy and your confidence. And honestly, I've used it. I've had other clients, really big companies, to use it. And I said, it sounds a little hokey, but it really works. It really works. It gets you into your body. The other thing I would say, and I'm going to quote Carla Harris, who is one of the top women on Wall Street and has been there for over 25 years. She has a couple of books, Expect to Win and Strategize to Win. And she has this really great and very simplistic way of also managing how you show up in meetings. And it is to come up with 3 adjectives to describe how you want to show up and how you want people to receive you in meetings. It could be strategic, intentional, thoughtful. And then when you're in those meetings, write those 3 words down. Think about how you embody those three adjectives. You could even do visualization, which I talk a lot with clients about that as well, is to visualize yourself embodying those different terms in the meeting. The reality here is it may not feel good. It may, you may, have heart palpitations, and you may feel your palms may be sweaty. At the same time, what we know through research is that when you are uncomfortable, you are growing.
Yes.
And the more that you kind of step into that zone of discomfort, the easier it becomes. And it's not to say that you're not going to have those things to happen. They're going to happen. But this is really around harnessing your courage to push past the moment, to stay in integrity with who you want to be and how you want to show up. It starts first with self, in that respect. And like I said, you could be in an environment where, you can think and noodle and go back and come back. But now in a space where a lot of organizations are looking for fast answers, time is of the essence. And so, it's kind of this popcorn like effect. Like, we need all ideas, all hands on deck. So you have to figure out, what is your lane in that respect.
That's really, so everything that I'm hearing from you right now is all about intentionality. Like, one of the worst things it feels like that you can do then is to come into a first job and start winging it. Okay, let's do this. I'm showing up at 9 without any forethought, without any intention. It seems to me like a lot of this is knowing where you are now, where you want to be next, and sort of moving the needle closer and closer to that step, to that stage.
And it's interesting you should mention intention, because a lot of times with my clients, I talk about intention and being strategic. And you need both in order to really manage your career and advance in the way that you'd like to. It's just important to be intentional about how you show up, and then also condition yourself. I always tell clients, think about, for folks who have participated in a marathon. When you run a marathon, you're not going to come to the race cold.
Right.
You'll pass out probably if you do that. It takes months and months of training. And it's not just training physically, it's training mentally as well, because you're going to have to run all those miles, and you can anticipate the type of obstacles that you may be faced with. So similarly, when you are in your work environment, as you're gearing up to start your career, it's important to train and condition yourself. A part of that is certainly the amazing work that, the students have done at UTC and engaging with folks like yourself. But there's also work that's deeper, that is more intrapersonal. It's really getting deep around who you are, getting a clear view into if you have any limiting beliefs about yourself. What are those limiting beliefs? And then how do you begin to counter them with a plan so that you can show up the way that you like?
In our course guide, you put together a first year map for us, and you go sort of by quarters of a year to talk us through what to start concentrating on in that first year. Would you mind walking through those phases for us? I'm so excited to have the author live for this, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the idea here was to ensure that when transitioning from college to corporate, that there was a clear map. And again, you could even look at these phases as milestones. Like for your first year, kind of going back to what I was sharing with you earlier. So thinking about the build stage. When you come into a new environment, especially if it's a corporate environment, you are establishing your foundation, right? And you want to make sure that the foundation is built upon two things. Number one, results and relationships. And oftentimes, and I've been there too. So guys, everything that I'm sharing with you, certainly I've had clients to experience, but I have seen different missteps in my own career, and this is based upon wisdom. So earlier in my career, I felt like, wow, my results will speak for themselves because
Yes.
I am an introvert and I don't want to engage in relationships. And then once I started to see my peers starting to get promoted, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we're literally doing the same work, delivering the same type of results, but they were going out really cultivating relationships. I knew then that I needed to step outside of my introversion and really start to cultivate stronger relationships. And one of the things that I said recently at a conference last year is that results will get you noticed, but relationships will get you promoted. At the end of the day, people are at the table in those talent assessments assessing whether or not you're ready for not even just a promotion, but a new assignment. So it's important to understand who are those people? How do you start to engage with them? And again, it gets back to perhaps creating a stakeholder map that will identify the formal and informal leaders, peers who can be supportive. And again, looking at the matrix environment where it's not just your manager, but you have other people who you're accountable to, and even customers as well, because for folks who may be moving into a sales type of environment, there are external relationships that you need to manage as well that bleed over into your results. So I definitely think it's important to build relationships as well as results. Think about understanding the organization. A lot of you probably are familiar with the SWOT analysis. Look at a SWOT analysis to understand the internal threats, the external threats, and just anything that will give you a view into that organization. And the other piece I would say is to be really mindful of your brand. What is your brand? What is your unique promise of value that people can expect from you? Whether you have internal clients or external clients, I want you to think about your brand and how do you represent your brand in the best way so that when people start thinking of you, they'll think about your brand and think about how you show up in meetings, how you deliver value. And it's not just what you do. And this is something I think is really important. It's not just the what, like, oh, this is what I did, but how did you get there as well? And oftentimes in the talent review meetings, when you have two employees and they're on equal footing, the differentiator will be, well, how did they do that? How did they deliver results? Were they working with a team? Were they leading the team? Did they have emotional intelligence and emotional regulation when they're engaging with people, even though they may be upset, but did they keep their cool and their calmness about themselves? So it's important. And I honestly believe that you have the power to educate and train people on how you want to be received in an organization. And oftentimes we think, oh, well, they're deciding, who I am, and they're deciding, how they see me. But in actuality, you can begin training people on how to see you and how to value you.
And that's part of that practice of writing down those adjectives before you walk into a meeting.
Exactly.
Right.
Write down the adjectives before you walk in. Make sure that you are embodying the adjectives and not just visualize yourself. Take some time and visualize. Often, a lot of people, especially students, are doing a lot of mindfulness practices and meditating. Meditate on those three adjectives until they become just a part of who you are.
Right.
But it's important to do that with a level of intention.
Absolutely. Okay. So that's the first couple of months. What's next?
So I do have here, create a career development plan. And so this is really the learn phase. So now that you have some work under your belt, start to think about your strengths, start to think about things that energize you about the work that you're doing. Start to think about work activities that may drain you. So the way that I look at strengths is a strength is something that actually energizes you and it makes you so excited, like you get lost in the day doing that work. Right. Whereas a weakness is anything that actually drains you. Now, I want to say this, that there is no such thing as a perfect job where it's like 100% I am strengthened through and through. Maybe there's a rare case for that. But if you could have a position where it's 80-20,
Yeah.
or 70-30, where it's like 80% I feel really energized, but 20% of the time there are things that weaken me. I experience it. I have my own business, but it weakens me to do administrative work or even like the invoicing. But I want to get paid, so I'm going to have to figure it out.
Because the paycheck is energizing.
Yes, a paycheck is definitely energizing. And then also just looking for other ways to learn and grow. So thinking about ways that you can do some job shadowing, for example. So as you think about, again, once you've established your foundation in your core areas of responsibility, what are some other ways that you can continue to learn and grow and build your skill set, in your job? So I think that those are some things that are important.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to start the learning phase after you've built these relationships, because then it makes the learning more contextualized. So you understand who are the best people to learn from.
Exactly.
Who are the people of influence who can see you learning, like that sort of stuff. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. Exactly. And I did mention the mentors as well. So I definitely think it's important to have mentors within an organization as well as externally, because I think it's important to have a view of the outside world. Sometimes we get so locked into the corporate culture of our own respective organizations that we lose sight that, there are additional learnings even outside. So definitely have both. And then the other piece I would say, it's not on here, but it's definitely something I feel like I've been talking a lot with my clients about, because I think sometimes we have the tendency to be over mentored and under sponsored. What I mean by that is a sponsor will be someone who puts their political capital on the line to recommend you for an opportunity. And that opportunity could be an assignment, it could be a promotion, or it could be some other type of scenario where you're able to move forward in your career. And I think it's important that the students understand, yes, mentoring is great, but make sure you understand who are your sponsors as well. And it's not just about, let me ask this person to be my, sponsor, but think more so in terms of sponsoring action. So, hey, you realize this person is influential. Would you be open to recommending me for this particular opportunity? And here's why. Now, granted, you're not going to go to the person cold. Hopefully, in phase one, you would have established a relationship. And sometimes mentoring relationships end up turning into sponsor type of relationships. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the sponsor piece. I think that that's essential.
So tell me a little bit then more about mentoring. So what kind of person should you be looking out for in order to find a mentor?
Someone who has connectivity to the work that you aspire to do. And it could be people who are higher up in the work that you're doing, or people, again, you have aspirations of doing a certain body of work. Maybe it's to be in supply chain, but right now, because of the economic climate, you had to take a role in HR.
Right.
So you would be strategic and intentional about looking for mentors in the supply chain organization, using that example. And again, it gets back to the relationships. Wow, I'm here today. I'm in the environment. I'm not doing exactly what I want to do, but I've already started establishing mentoring relationships over here in supply chain, for example. So I think it's important, where do you want to be strategically aligned in the organization? Also, who has political capital? You can start to observe when you're in the room or virtual room who has a certain level of influence. And that's the other piece I would say, really not just pay attention to what you're doing and what you're going to say in the meeting, but start to make observations of how other people are engaging. Who seems like they're kind of the formal leader or the informal leader? Who has the most influence? Those are the type of people you should be building strategic alliances with, whether it's mentorship or sponsorship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Okay,
so you're there for 6 months.
Yes.
What's
Yeah, so this is really about growing your skill set, but then also growing your profile. There are a lot of different internal organizations as well as external groups that you can be a part of.
Mm.
So, for instance, you may want to consider taking an assignment, a stretch assignment on another person's team. You could also enjoy join an employee resource group or a business resource group, which essentially are these affinity groups where there is a shared likeness, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, for example. And what's nice about those groups, and I've actually done a lot of work with those groups over the past 4 years, is that you have an opportunity to connect and engage, number one, but from a career perspective, you have an opportunity to step in leadership roles. And they not obviously formal, they're formal within the actual employee resource group. Oftentimes, these employee resource groups are aligned to a strategic executive within the organization. Each of them will have a strategic or executive sponsor. So I think it's important to think about how you grow your profile. You could also be a brand ambassador for the organization. And, you know, most of you all students, you have social media accounts. So how can you support and elevate the brand of your organization? And that's another way of expanding and growing your profile, which ultimately helps to grow your brand within the organization. And then the other piece I would say is really start to understand what's important to the organization from a philanthropic perspective. So what are community initiatives? Oftentimes, especially in bigger organizations, there will be these altruistic community efforts that they have. In fact, a lot of the bigger organizations are now giving a bank of time in like a week of off for employees to engage in community service. So what are some philanthropic initiatives you can engage in? It helps to build your brand that are aligned to the company. You could even consider board leadership. I've helped some of my clients think about how they could cultivate their leadership skills in a way where they're not necessarily in a formal role, but they're building their way toward the formal role. And philanthropic board leadership is always a really great option.
Right, and it's a visual for the organization. They see you as a leader in
Exactly.
an organization that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
at this point, is this a good time to start thinking about professional associations to be a part of outside of the organization? Like, for instance, if you're an accountant and you wanted to be part of the Tennessee CPA group, is that about right to start thinking about joining one of those?
Yes, you can bring in this knowledge from these groups into your organization.
Right.
So getting back to being intentional and strategic, you know, they have conferences, regional conferences, national conferences, or even just, you know, they have meetings. And so they bring in thought leaders within those respective areas that you can take that knowledge back, bring it back to your organizations, and you know, bring forth new solutions and recommendations. So definitely, I think it's a great way to continue to build your profile. And then oftentimes they have leadership type of roles that you can take on as well.
Excellent. Your next phase is the assessment phase.
Yeah. So the next phase is the assessment piece.
When do you feel like you're ready to step back and assess?
So I definitely think from a timing perspective, it's important. Like for instance, I wouldn't start assessing after 2 or 3 months because you're still getting used to being in the organization.
Right.
Definitely just thinking about the normal course of business, for example, most of the times organization will have an annual performance review process.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
So that could also be an indicator that it's time for you to assess. So for instance, when I was in corporate full time, you know, I knew I would have my annual performance, you know, review or appraisal. And so before I would meet with my manager, I would do my own assessment because I was curious to understand how my assessment measured up against his or her assessment. And so part of that could be a 360. It doesn't necessarily have to be formal where you hire a coach like myself to do that for you, but you could just start gathering feedback from your peers, from your managers, from cross-functional partners to gather, how have you performed? What has worked well? What would you change? Or is there anything that you think I should be doing differently? Things of that nature, just to start assessing where you are. And I think there's the assessment around skills, but also there's the internal assessment around, am I happy doing what I'm doing? Am I energized with the work?
Mm.
Or would I like to do differently going into the next year? Maybe this isn't the right path for me. Maybe this isn't the right company for me.
Mm.
So it's looking at, the type of work you're doing. It's looking at assessing the environmental conditions. So now you've been entrenched in the environment or the company for a while. So what do you really know for sure about the cultural dynamics? So thinking about in phase one, where you're starting to establish your understanding, now you've lived in the environment for a while. Is this really the environment that you want to be in culturally? How is the organization responding, to things that are happening in the world? Employees are now taking stock of how are their companies responding. They're assessing, is this really where I want to be? So it's not just the work and the skills, but it's also assessing the organization.
Interesting. So what would you say to a student, or actually at this point, someone who's a young professional or an emerging professional who stops to assess and they realize that their strengths are not being tapped into, that the culture is not one that they are proud to be a part of, that the mission is not one that they can stand behind? Is that a good time to jump ship? Or what would you say to a person who's going through that conflict?
Yeah, so I would certainly ensure that I have all the data points, right? And it's not just because sometimes something will happen and
it's a gut reaction.
a gut reaction, like, okay, I'm just done with this organization, and they just kind of throw out all these years, or they throw out the past year. And so I would definitely get clear about, is this an anomaly? Is this a one-time situation? Or is there a trend that I'm seeing where I feel like this isn't really the best scenario? If it's a matter of the work may not be aligned, I always encourage my clients to have a conversation with your manager and see if there's something that could be changed about the work that you're doing. Or again, tapping into your mentors, tapping into the sponsors to see perhaps if they have recommendations on other bodies of work that you could engage in. But I think it's important to have an informed point of view, because it's not really up to your manager to say, here's what you should be doing. If you are having conflict around the work, you should have a perspective on what you want to do.
Yeah.
So that would be
coming not only with a problem, but some sort of idea on how to resolve
it. But if there is on the other side of the coin, if there is a conflict around the work environment, maybe the core values are misaligned with the deeds that you see of the company, you really need to start to take a step back and ask yourself, is this really where I want to be?
Yeah.
Because you don't have to stay there.
Right.
You have a choice, you have agency. There's so many different ways of moving in the world from a career perspective nowadays. And so I would encourage these young professionals to know that you don't have to be a prisoner to your resume. You don't have to be handcuffed to a job or an organization that is not serving you.
So let me ask a question. So I feel like the conversation with your boss, let's say, if you're having an issue where you want certain strengths to be tapped into that aren't, or you're seeing a conflict of values around, either your position or your organization and yourself. What's the best way to approach that conversation? Is it like a walk in and say, hey, do you have a few minutes to talk? Or how do you suggest people actually go out and have that conversation once they've assessed and they feel a disconnect?
So I definitely think, especially now since we're in the virtual world, it's important to schedule time, right? Because we're not in a scenario where it's like, oh, let me just grab a cup of coffee. You can do a virtual, coffee chat. But I do think it's important to go into the conversation with your data points, not just rhetoric for lack of a better term. And I would focus on attacking the problem and not the person or the organization. I think that that's so important, where you're not coming in thinking, like, oh, I'm just going to attack the person or the entity, but attack the problem, but create space for yourself to express how you have felt. Here's what happened, X, like, here are my 3 points around experiences, and this is how it made me feel, or this is where I felt like I was struggling. Can you help me understand why this was done that way? So you could go in with your data, expressing how it made you feel from your vantage point, but also asking a series of open-ended questions to draw out the thinking from your manager.
Right.
And I would also say give your manager grace as well, especially if your manager is not the culprit, if you will.
Right.
Because sometimes they're put in very peculiar situations.
Yes.
And they have to,
middle. Yeah.
yeah, especially in the middle, where things are coming from the top, and they have to be the deliverer of information, and it may not be them, but there's this whole idea of being a good corporate citizen, where they have to just follow suit. So I would just say give your manager grace, express yourself. And here's what I love about Generation Z and millennials, is that most of the time they really don't have an issue with expressing themselves.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like they're extremely voiced, and in talking with older clients, more seasoned clients, they actually admire that trait in this particular generation, that having a voice, like, they're going to have a voice, they're going to share when something doesn't work well for them. But again, you want to do it with a level of grace.
Absolutely.
You also want to come with also a level of empathy as well. I think that that's important.
So the focus is problem solving more than venting.
Yes, problem solving. There's vent to your friends, vent to your, yes, but this is not about venting. This is about how do we solve this problem, like, and have some thoughts on ways to solve it. The manager's not receptive, or your manager's not receptive, then you have to start to make some serious decisions about, is this really where I need to be?
Right. Yeah. Or is this a signal?
Is this a signal?
Yeah. What are some of your final thoughts that you want to share with this group?
Be intentional and be strategic with your career. Focus on your milestones. Your experience may not necessarily look like your peers. It could look totally different. But the beauty is you have the agency to create your path.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. I just love hearing your voice and hearing your advice personally. I've been taking some notes on the side. So thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you.